The form had one mistake on it. Just one. A single field in the third section of the 12-section standard Conclave Volunteer Defense Corps intake form, where the applicant was required to indicate their species designation using the Conclave's official taxonomic registry code. The code for human was H7741. The code for Hethvari was H7714. The difference was 2 transposed digits in a field that the intake processing system validated for format rather than content, which meant the system confirmed that a valid code had been entered without confirming that the valid code matched the applicant. The applicant was Corporal James Osei of the United Earth Navy, 26 years old, 4 years of service, currently on extended leave following a mission that had ended in a way that the official record described as operationally concluded, and that James described, when he described it at all, as the reason he had not slept properly in 4 months. He had filled out the intake form at 200 on a Thursday in the kind of sleepless state that produced transposed digits, because 200 was when the decision to do something had become stronger than the reasons not to. And the something he had decided to do was apply to the Volunteer Defense Corps unit that had been his best friend's unit before his best friend stopped being something that required the present tense. The unit was the Hethvari First Response Vanguard. The Hethvari were a species that James had encountered 3 times in 4 years of service, and that he had found, on each encounter, to be the most simultaneously impressive and terrifying beings he had interacted with in a military context. They were tall, not in the way that some species were tall, proportionally elongated. Tall in the way that suggested the planet they had evolved on had different ideas about scale than most. They had 4 arms, which they used with the specific unconscious competence of beings who had never experienced the limitation of 2, and a sensory apparatus that included perception in ranges that made their situational awareness in combat environments something that James's training described as exceptional, and that James's experience described as watching someone play a game with information that everyone else in the room did not have access to. The Hethvari First Response Vanguard was not just a Hethvari unit. It was a specific Hethvari unit, the one that had a 200-year history and a combat record that the Conclave's Military History Division had dedicated 3 volumes to, and that James had read all 3 of during the 4 months he had not been sleeping properly. Not because he had been assigned to read them, but because reading about people who did this and survived it was one of the things that helped at 200. The unit was also exclusively female. Not as a policy, as a cultural practice that had been continuous since the unit's founding 200 years ago, rooted in a Hethvari military tradition that James had read about in Volume 1, and that he understood intellectually, without fully understanding in the way that cultural practices required being inside them to fully understand. He had not known this when he filled out the form at 200. He had read 3 volumes about the unit's combat history. He had not, in 4 months of reading at 200, read the intake requirements. The intake processing system validated H7714. The notification of acceptance arrived at 3:47. James read it at 3:51 when his alarm went off, which it did every morning because mornings required structure, and structure was one of the things that helped. He read the notification twice. Then he read the unit designation. Then he looked up the unit's intake requirements. He sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at the notification again. Then he looked at the intake form confirmation that showed H7714, where H7741 should have been. He thought about several things in sequence. He thought about the fact that he had been accepted. He thought about the fact that he had been accepted under a misidentification. He thought about the correct thing to do, which was to contact the intake division and explain the error. He thought about his best friend, who had been in this unit for 2 years before the thing that made James stop using the present tense, and who had described the unit in messages that James had read hundreds of times in 4 months, and that had the quality of someone who had found the thing they were looking for and knew it. He thought about 200 and the decision. He sent a message to the intake division. The message said, "I believe there has been an error in my application. I am human, not HFY. My registry code should be H7741. I apologize for the confusion and will understand if the acceptance requires review." The response came at 6:12. It said, "Intake division has reviewed the notation. The error has been corrected in the registry. Your acceptance stands. Report to Vanguard Base HFY on the attached date. Welcome to the First Response Vanguard, Corporal Osai." James read the response 3 times. He read it a 4th time because the 4th time was when he processed the part that said your acceptance stands, and connected it to the part that said the error has been corrected, and understood that the intake division had known about the error, had corrected it, and had maintained the acceptance anyway. He sat with that for a long time. Then he packed his kit. Vanguard Base HFY was on the HFY home world, in a region that the species' geological history had made dramatic in the way that planets were dramatic when their formation had been violent, and the violence had left behind landscapes that communicated the scale of the forces that had produced them. The base itself had been built into the side of a formation that James, arriving on a clear morning with his kit over one shoulder and the notification in his pocket, found himself stopping to look at for longer than he intended, because the formation was the kind of thing that stopped you. The base commander was a being named Commander Voth Wren. She was tall in the way that James had expected, 4 arms, the sensory apparatus that gave her a quality of attention that felt like being read rather than watched. She was also, in the first 30 seconds of James standing in front of her desk, the most precisely intimidating presence he had encountered in 4 years of service, not because she did anything intimidating, but because the combination of what she was and how she held it produced an atmosphere that his nervous system classified without consulting him. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Corporal Osai." He said, "Commander." She said, "You are human." He said, "Yes, Commander." She said, "You are aware that this unit has a 200-year history as an exclusively HFY formation." He said, "Yes, Commander." "I read all 3 volumes." She looked at him. She said, "All 3." He said, "Yes, Commander." She said, "Volume 3 covers the Drakvari engagement at Marin Station. The tactical analysis in Section 4 is classified above the standard public access level. How did you access it?" He said, "My clearance is current from my Navy posting. The clearance level covers Section 4. She looked at him for another moment. She said, "Why are you here?" He looked at her steadily. He had thought about this question, had known it was coming, had decided in the thinking about it that the answer was the true answer or it was nothing. He said, "Corporal Dami Essian was my best friend. She served in this unit for 2 years. She described it in a way that I have been reading for 4 months. I applied because she did, and because reading her messages is the closest I can get to understanding what she found here, and I thought maybe being here was closer than that." Commander Wren looked at him. The room was very quiet. She said, "Essian spoke of you." He said she did. She said you were stubborn. He said she was not wrong. Commander Wren looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The unit will have opinions about your presence. You will hear them. You will not respond to them in any way that I would find professionally objectionable. You will do the work at the standard the unit requires or you will be released. The standard is not adjusted for species." He said, "I understand." She said, "Do you?" He said, "Commander Essian described the standard in her messages. I have been training to it for 4 months." Commander Wren looked at him one final time. She said, "Report to Sergeant Valeth Ken. She will assign your quarters and your training schedule. You have 3 days before the unit's field assessment. You will participate." He said, "Yes, Commander." He turned to leave. She said, "Corporal." He turned back. She said, Volume 3, Section 4. The decision Vanguard Commander Thessa made at Marin Station when the extraction window was closing and she chose to hold the position. What do you think of it? He looked at her. He said, "I think she was right. The window was closing and holding the position bought the time the convoy needed, and the math on the alternative was worse. She was right." Commander Wren looked at him. She said, "Every military historian who has reviewed that section has described the decision as a tactical error that produced a fortunate outcome. You are the first person who has read it and said she was right." He said, "Then they read the wrong version of the geometry." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Report to Sergeant Ken." Sergeant Valeth Ken was not intimidating in the way that Commander Wren was intimidating. She was intimidating in a different way, in the way that someone was intimidating when they had a specific and comprehensive opinion of you before you arrived, and the opinion was not favorable, and they were not concealing it. She assigned his quarters. She assigned his training schedule. She said, "You have 3 days. The field assessment is 48 hours of simulated engagement in terrain that the unit has operated in for 200 years and that you have never seen. The assessment standard requires you to function at unit operational tempo without degrading the team's performance metrics. If you degrade the team's performance metrics, you are released." He said, "Understood." She said, "Do you want to know how many non-Hethvari have attempted integration with this unit in 200 years? He said, "I know the answer is none." Volume 1, Intake History section. She looked at him. She said, "You read the Intake History section?" He said, "I read everything in all 3 volumes." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because Damie was in this unit and I wanted to understand it." Ken looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not the expression she had been wearing. That was something underneath the expression she had been wearing that the expression had been covering, and that she allowed to be visible for approximately 2 seconds before the covering came back. She said, "Your kit goes in the 4th room on the left. Training begins at 500. Do not be late." He was not late. He was early, which was different from not late in the way that his father had explained to him at age 12, and that 4 years of military service had confirmed, which was that on time was the minimum and early was the statement, and the statement mattered in units where the minimum was the floor rather than the standard. The unit had 18 members, including Ken. They were all present at 4:55 when James arrived at the training area. They were also all looking at him with the specific quality of a group that had discussed him before he arrived, and had arrived at a collective position that individual members were now expressing through the medium of how they were standing. James had been in military units for 4 years. He knew how units expressed collective positions through the medium of standing. He knew what this position said. He found a spot in the formation, the end of the line, where new members went. He stood at attention. At 500 exactly, Ken arrived and began. The 3 days were the hardest 3 days of James's life. Not because the training was impossible, though it was the most demanding physical and tactical training he had encountered in 4 years of service. Because the training was designed for beings who were built differently than he was built, who processed information through a sensory apparatus he did not have, who moved through space with 4 arms in ways that had been developing for 200 years of unit history, and that produced a collective operational language that he had read about and could not fully understand until he was in the middle of it. He was in the middle of it. He did not degrade the performance metrics. Not because he matched the unit's performance level in every category. He did not. There were things the HFY did that he could not do, and he spent the 3 days finding the things he could do instead that produced equivalent operational value, which required him to look at every situation the training produced with the specific attention of someone who was playing the game with different tools, and needed to find the version of the game those tools played best. 9 years of survey thinking he did not have. 4 years of military service he had. And the specific quality of someone who had spent 4 months not sleeping properly at 200 reading 3 volumes about people who did this and survived it, which had produced in him a detailed and specific knowledge of the unit's operational history and tactical doctrine that none of the unit members had, because the unit members were inside the history and did not need to read it. On the second day, during a simulated extraction exercise in the terrain the base occupied, the unit was in a position that the simulation parameters had constructed to have no optimal solution, the kind of position that field assessments used to find the difference between operators who looked for the right answer and operators who found the best available answer when the right one was not there. Ken, running the extraction, had the expression of someone processing options that were all inadequate. James looked at the terrain. He saw the resonance point. Not literally, not the same thing, but the same structure. The thing that the terrain offered that military geometry did not look for, because military geometry was not survey geometry, and survey geometry looked at environments and found what they contained rather than what was expected. He said, "Sergeant." Ken looked at him. He said, "The formation on the northern face. The acoustic properties of that section reflect the simulation's detection parameters. If we move the team to that section, the detection signature drops by an estimated 60%. Ken looked at the northern face. She looked at him. She said, "How do you know the acoustic properties?" He said, "The geological composition is visible in the surface texture. The composition produces specific acoustic reflection characteristics. It is in Volume 2, Environmental Analysis section, the HFY Home World Terrain chapter." She looked at the formation. She said, "Move." They moved. The detection signature dropped by 58%. Which was close enough to 60 that Ken made a note in her assessment file and did not share the note with James, which was the appropriate professional response to a note that said what the note said. The field assessment ended at 600 on the 3rd day. The unit assembled for the after-action review. James stood at the end of the line. Commander Wren attended the review. She did not attend all reviews. She attended this one. Ken presented the metrics, went through the exercise phases, reached the extraction exercise, described the northern face decision. She said the detection signature reduction was 58%. The source of the analysis was Corporal Osai. The unit looked at James. He looked at the front of the room. Wren said, "Corporal Osai, how did you develop knowledge of this terrain's geological composition?" He said, "I read the environmental analysis section of Volume 2. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because Damie described the terrain in her messages, and I wanted to see what she was seeing." The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that happened when something true was said in a room, and the truth was the kind that changed the quality of the air. Wren looked at him for a long moment. She said, "The unit will vote on integration acceptance. This is the protocol for any candidate completing field assessment. The vote is private. The result will be communicated to you within 24 hours." He said, "Yes, Commander." He spent the 24 hours in the way he had been spending 200 for 4 months, which was with the things that helped. He ran the terrain. He read. He wrote a message that he did not send to anyone because there was no one to send it to, but that he wrote anyway because writing it was one of the things that helped. The message said, "I think I understand now what you found here. It is not what I expected, and it is exactly what you said. I think I am going to stay if they let me. I think you would tell me to stay. I think the geometry is right. At 800 the following morning, Ken found him in the training area. She stood in front of him. She said 18 votes, 17 in favor, 1 abstention. He looked at her. She said, the abstention was mine. He said, I see. She said, I do not abstain because I voted against you. I abstain because I do not vote in integration assessments for candidates who were referred by fallen unit members. It is a personal protocol. It removes the conflict. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, she talked about you. Ken said, I know. He said, she said you were the best operator she had ever seen. Ken said, she was the best we had. The words landed in the space between them, and neither of them did anything with them for a moment because some things did not require anything done with them. Then Ken said, the unit has standards. You met the field assessment standard. You will be held to the operational standard from this point. The operational standard is not adjusted. He said, I know. She said, Corporal Osei, why are you stubborn? He looked at her. He said, because the geometry usually disagrees if you look long enough. She looked at him. Something moved across her expression. The same thing that had moved across it in the quarters corridor, the something underneath, visible for 2 seconds. She said, training at 500 tomorrow. He said, I will be early. She said, I know. She turned and walked away. He stood in the training area and looked at the northern face formation and the terrain that Damie had described in messages he had read hundreds of times and that he was looking at now with his own eyes. He thought it looked exactly like she had said. He thought the geometry was right. He stayed. 4 months later, during a joint conclave rapid response deployment to the Vethar system, the Hethvari First Response Vanguard was attached to a multi-species task force as the lead extraction element. The task force commander, a Velthun general named Araz who had been running combined operations for 30 years, received the unit's operational integration report and noted, in the section that listed unit composition, the H7741 designation that appeared alongside the 17 H7714 designations. She called Commander Wren. She said, there is a human in your unit. Wren said, yes, General. She said, the First Response Vanguard has been exclusively Hethvari for 200 years. Wren said, yes, General. She said, how did this happen? Wren said, he read all 3 volumes. Araz looked at the operational integration report. She said, all 3. Wren said, including section 4 of volume 3. Araz said, that section is classified above standard public access. Wren said, his clearance covers it. Araz said, and he read it. Wren said, he read it and told me she was right. Araz was quiet for a moment. She said, what is his operational assessment? Wren said, he reads terrain the way no one I have trained with reads terrain. He does not have our sensory capability, and he does not try to compensate for it. He finds what his capability does that ours does not, and he uses that. In 4 months, he has contributed 3 tactical analyses that produced outcomes the unit's standard doctrine would not have found. Araz was quiet again. She said, and the unit? Wren said, the unit voted 17-0 in favor of retention after the first operational deployment. The one who abstained in the integration vote did not abstain in the retention vote. Araz said, who abstained in the integration vote? Wren said, Sergeant Ken. Araz said, Ken abstained and then voted for retention. Wren said, yes, General. Araz looked at the operational integration report for a long moment. She said, I have been running combined operations for 30 years. I have integrated hundreds of cross-species unit compositions. I have never integrated a human into a HFY formation. Ren said, no one has, General. It has not been done before. HFY said, how is it working? Ren was quiet for a moment. She said, he finds the geometry that we do not look for. He does not look for it deliberately. He looks at things the way he looks at things, and the geometry is what he sees. In 200 years of this unit, I have not had an operator who saw geometry the way he sees it. HFY said, and the dynamic with the unit. Ren said, complicated for the first 6 weeks. Then Sergeant Ken used an analysis he provided to bring the team out of a training scenario with 0 casualties, when the standard outcome model had the scenario at 30% casualty rate. After that, it was different. HFY said, how different? Ren said, he reads at 200, most nights. The unit started leaving materials outside his quarters, things they thought he should read. Things about the unit, about the history, about what the unit had been. He reads them and he talks about them at training, and they listen differently when he talks about their history than they listen when they talk about their own history. Because he is outside it and inside it at the same time, and the combination produces something I do not have a word for yet. HFY was quiet for a long time. She said, Commander Ren, I am assigning your unit as lead extraction for the HFY deployment. I am also submitting a recommendation to the Conclave's Combined Operations Division that the HFY First Response Vanguard integration model be studied for potential application in other cross-species unit compositions. Ren said, yes, General. HFY said, the human, his name. Ren said, Corporal James Osai. HFY said, how did he come to apply to your unit? Ren said, he transposed 2 digits on a form at 200. HFY said, he applied to a unit whose intake requirements he did not check. Ren said, he checked them after. He sent a message to the intake division explaining the error and offering to withdraw. HFY said, and? Ren said, and he was accepted anyway. HFY looked at the operational integration report one more time. She said, General HFY out. She closed the channel. She sat in her office and thought about 2 transposed digits at 200, about a form filed in the kind of sleepless state that produced mistakes, about the mistake that had been corrected, and the acceptance that had stood, and a 26-year-old human who had read all 3 volumes including the classified section, and had reported to a unit that had never had a non-HFY member, and had been early on the first day, and had found the geometry that the unit did not look for and had stayed. She thought about Sergeant Ken, who had abstained in the integration vote because of a personal protocol and had not abstained in the retention vote. She thought about what that meant. She thought it meant the geometry was right. She submitted the recommendation. The Conclave's Combined Operations Division received it and read it, and flagged it for the broader cross-species integration research program that had been running for 12 years, and that had, in 12 years, produced 47 studies and 0 outcomes as significant as the thing that had happened because of 2 transposed digits at 200 on a Thursday, when a 26-year-old man who had not been sleeping properly decided to do something. The research program added a 48th study. They called it the Osai integration model. James did not know about the study for 3 years, when the 48th study was published, and a senior researcher sent him a message asking if he would consent to an interview. He was in the training area when the message arrived. He read it and looked at the terrain that Damie had described and that he had been looking at with his own eyes for 3 years. He wrote back and said he would consent to the interview. Then he went back to the training. At 500. Early.